everybody, welcome back to the show. This is The Mental Breakdown. I'm your host, Joey Velez, and today I wanted to talk to you about something that separates those elite performers from everybody else, and that's how to stay driven. Because when we look at elite athletes, performers or other high-level professionals, it's easy to assume that they're simply more motivated than the rest of us. They wake up every day hungry, they always want to work harder, they never get tired of training, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not really how motivation works. Elite performers and professionals experience frustration, boredom, setbacks, doubt, fatigue, just like everybody else. But the difference is not that they always feel motivated, it's that they have developed systems and habits that allow them to continue performing when the motivation isn't there. So, what keeps them going is that they have a strong sense of purpose. They know what they're working toward and they understand why it matters. There's a big difference in saying, I want to become the best, and saying, I want to become the best because I want to see how far I can push myself. That deeper reasoning becomes an anchor. When training gets difficult or, progress begins to slow down, the goal itself might not be enough to keep somebody moving. Now, your purpose is what keeps you connected to that process. Now, another thing they do is that elite performers focus on the process rather than constantly chasing the outcome. If your motivation depends entirely on winning, or achieving a certain result, then you're putting your motivation in the hands of things that you don't completely have control over. So instead, what elite performers tend to do is focus on those controllable behaviors, right? So did I prepare properly? Did I execute my routine properly? Did I get enough recovery? Did I give myself an opportunity to improve today? And that's important because progress isn't always that obvious. Sometimes you train for weeks and don't see any sort of improvement. Sometimes you compete and do everything correctly and still lose. Sometimes you make the right decision, but the outcome still doesn't go your way. If your motivation is tied exclusively to that scoreboard, to those results, those moments can be incredibly discouraging. But if your motivation is tied to the process, you can at least walk away thinking, did I do what I needed to do today? And if that answer is yes, then you have something to build on. Another thing they do is that, elite performers know how to use goals without becoming obsessed with them. Right? Goals are important for sure, but effective performers don't just set one massive goal and hope motivation carries them to that finish line. They break the goal down. Right? Maybe the ultimate goal is winning a championship, but today's goal might be improving one technical skill. Tomorrow might be recovery. The next day might be, how do I improve my decision making under fatigue? These create small wins, and small wins are important because motivation can be reinforced because you now have evidence that your effort is actually producing progress. You don't have to feel like you're making a massive transformation every single day. Sometimes staying driven means recognizing that you are just 1% better than you were yesterday. Another thing is that elite performers understand that discipline is a more reliable tool than motivation. This might be one of the biggest misconceptions about, elite athletes is that they often, wake up excited to train. And, the truth of the matter is sometimes they don't. There are days where they don't want to practice. There are days when they're tired. There are days when they'd rather stay in bed, I'm sure. But they've developed routines that reduce the need to make a decision. They don't ask themselves in those moments, like, do I feel motivated to train today? The answer is often irrelevant. The training is simply what they do. And that's the power of having a routine. When a behavior becomes habitual, you don't have to constantly negotiate with yourself about whether you're going to do it. And, that's especially important when you're pursuing a long-term goal because long-term goals are usually pretty boring before they get exciting. There are thousands of repetitions, practices, workouts, meetings, ordinary days that happen before that big moment hits. Elite performance is built during those ordinary days. So, lastly, elite performers know how to redefine setbacks. So failure can either become evidence that you're not good enough or information about what you need to improve. Elite performers tend to lean towards that second interpretation. A bad performance doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not capable. It can mean something about my preparation, my strategy, my execution, or my mindset that needs to change. And that distinction is very important because if you interpret failure as a threat to your identity, you're more likely to avoid those situations. But if you interpret failure as information, then you can actually use it. And that's where resilience comes into play, is because, the most driven performers aren't necessarily the people who experience a few setbacks. They're the ones who are better at recovering from a psychological standpoint and reconnecting with their purpose. So if you're listening to this and thinking, I'm just not as motivated as I used to be, consider something else, right? Maybe you don't need more motivation. Maybe what you need is a clear reason. Maybe you need a better routine. Maybe you need to break down your goals into smaller targets, or maybe you need to shift your attention to those controllable behaviors as opposed to what the outcome is. Or maybe you need to stop interpreting a setback as evidence that you're not good enough, or that you're falling short. Because elite performers aren't superhuman, believe it or not. They don't wake every day with unlimited motivation. They've simply learned how to keep moving when motivation fluctuates. And that's really the key. Motivation gets you started, purpose gives you direction, but discipline, habits, and commitment to the process are what keep you moving. So the next time you find yourself struggling to stay driven, don't ask, how can I get myself more motivated? Ask yourself, what am I working toward? Why does it matter? What can I control? And most importantly, what's the next thing I need to do? Because elite performance isn't about being motivated every day. It's about being consistent every single day, showing up every single day, especially on those days when you aren't motivated. And that's what I have for y'all today. Okay, thank you for stopping by. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, rate, review, download the podcast, share with your family and friends. I'll talk to y'all soon. Don't forget, today's a great day to make an impact on someone's life. All right, y'all have a good one.